the city of St. Louis, you're listening to the Don't Push Pause podcast with your hosts, Justin Johnson and Lindsay Reber.
Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Justin.
How's it going, Lindsay?
Yeah, it's going okay. I'm pretty passable.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be talking with you again. I can't wait to do it in person. How are you doing?
I'm all right. I'm sort of feeling like a laundromat that needs maintenance in a way.
Oh, yeah.
But then on the other end of
familiar
it,
with that.
I'm happy that we're talking movies tonight. It always makes me feel much, much better. And this particular movie tonight, I think I really relate to it a lot. A lot of that humor and pain mixed together. The sort of like dark humor of life and the world, relationships.
Yeah, this describes my entire life thus far, I think. Just pain.
Yeah.
And a movie like Rushmore is easily identifiable in your daily life. You can extrapolate anything, any theme out of this movie and be able to equate it with something that's happened in your life. Therefore, it makes you feel good in some way or makes you feel seen,
Yeah. It's kind of wild to me that we haven't done a Wes Anderson movie. Been doing this 3 years. You would think that we would have done one of his movies, considering we've doubled up on multiple directors for the podcast.
That's true.
But there was an opportunity. It's Bill Murray's birthday is coming up, and we do, of course, have a Murray moment with every episode. We're not going to have one for this episode since it's going to be so Murray related.
This whole episode's just a giant Murray moment, so there's that.
Yeah, I think Rushmore is like a great pick, and so much talk about this movie and Bill Murray's career. But Rushmore on its own is a really fantastic movie. It is one that I hadn't rewatched in a while, and so I was a little nervous coming into this because I adore Wes Anderson, but I really loved Rushmore, but I think it was like the movie of his that I hadn't seen in a while, and I had forgotten, it's a fine line because the main character of Max, played by Jason Schwartzman, is not the most likable kid. And I think the movie does a fine job of like making him, giving him enough humanity so you don't think he's just like a total spoiled piece of crap.
Yeah, you have to do that with a character like Max. You have to show him being vulnerable and showing him being beaten down. So the more crappy sides of his personality are offset by seeing that, he has feelings too.
Yeah. And and I think in its essence, this is a high school movie. It's framed a kid who's 15 and who's, also switching schools in the middle of a semester. So there's a lot of elements of like high school movies in this, but I think Wes Anderson has an original take here. And, we'll get into that too. Wes Anderson as a director really sticking out as one of the few, I think, directors of this generation where his style is so distinct that if anybody even tries to mimic a tiny bit of his work, it's immediately called out like, oh, they're trying to do like a Wes Anderson thing. I think the same thing with David Lynch and Scorsese, but Wes Anderson, I don't know. I mean, he may be the king of like the most distinct style of any director that I can think of.
It's just such a mixture of art and film. And not to say that all filmmakers aren't artists, but every one of his movies could be turned into a painting. There's another aspect going on there, and he's taking from his inspirations and other directors too, but taking those things that he's learned and turning it into his own motif.
And definitely, I think, again, hitting on this idea of dark humor, like finding humor in the realistic pains that we go through in life, like the ups and downs and tattered relationships and finding humility. So many themes in his movies, family structure, family dysfunction, being bullied, being an outcast, trying to assimilate, trying to fit in. So many themes throughout his career of all his movies, but we'll focus on Rushmore for this episode. We'll get into Anderson. We'll get into his relationship with Bill Murray. Obviously, we'll get into a lot of Bill Murray and how he became attached to this project.
We'll go into how Rushmore came about, how it got off the ground, and some fun casting stories. And later we'll go into more about certain trademarks that we see in Wes Anderson films, and specifically with Rushmore, the editing, production design, music. There's just a lot of feelings, too, behind this film. So I can't wait to dive into that.
Yeah, the music especially is in all of Wes Anderson's films, or soundtrack after soundtrack of great, songs selected from usually the 70s. But again, we're not going to be doing a Murray moment, but we will be doing our picks of the week for this episode. My pick of the week was Permanent Midnight, with a connection being, it was also shot by Robert Yeaman, who's been Wes Anderson's cinematographer from Bottle Rocket all the way to his most recent film. And also the movie has a co-starring role with Owen Wilson. And what was your pick?
This might be kind of a curveball. And I went with a movie that does feature Bill Murray. I couldn't pass up that opportunity. Come on. But it is 2000's Hamlet. Have you seen it?
I haven't. I actually, when you told me you're doing this one, I had to look it up because I didn't really know anything about it.
Very different from the original William Shakespeare story, of course. It was made hundreds of years later, but does stay very true to the story, and I can't wait to tell you all about it.
I look forward to that. Well, before we get into our first clip from Rushmore, Lindsay, can you just give us a brief lowdown, your interpretation of what this movie's about?
Oh, I always love to do that. So the extremely ambitious 15-year-old prep school student Max Fisher is on top when it comes to extracurricular activities, yet failing in all his actual classes. You see, he's got more enthusiasm than, say, aptitude. Filled with some uppity delusions of grandeur, Max finds himself smitten with Miss Cross, a first-grade teacher at his school, but his efforts to woo her are less than fulfilling. However, after meeting and befriending the disillusioned, borderline despondent father of some schoolmates, Mr. Bloom, Max figures maybe he can help him win Miss Cross's heart. In a twist of perceived treachery, though, Mr. Bloom and Miss Cross begin a secret affair, thus throwing Max's world into complete turmoil in this story about unlikely friends who become even more unlikely rivals, which then turns into a story about love, revenge, and heartache, and where acting immature won't win the heart of anyone.
I thought that summed it up really nice.
There's a lot of feelings going on in Rushmore, and this was a really nice revisit. I haven't been back to it in years, and found myself really living in my head with Rushmore for a couple weeks now, which has been somewhat of a comforting thing in these weird times that we live in these days.
Yeah, it's interesting sometimes whatever movie we're doing, we do spend a few weeks, researching, and we're watching it multiple times, and it becomes a part of that 2-week period. And depending on what movie we're doing and how things are going in our lives, it can be pretty interesting.
I told my friend Brett that we were doing Rushmore, and he's like, "Oh, thank God. When you were doing Taxi Driver, I was like, do I need to call the police on her?" Yeah, I'm thankful.
That was Taxi Driver was an interesting pick. That was my pick, so I put that on me.
I went right along with it, yeah. And I'm happy that I did. But sometimes I flash back to those moments, and I don't want to know Travis Bickle for at least another year. We're on a break now.
Yeah. Let's go to a clip from Rushmore. We'll come back. We'll talk about it.
Where did you go to school, by the way?
Harvard.
Really? That's a coincidence. My top schools where I want to apply to are Oxford and the Sorbonne. My safety's Harvard.
That's very ambitious.
Thank you.
What do you want to study?
Well, I haven't decided for sure, but Probably a double major in mathematics and pre-med. What was your major?
I didn't have a major, but my thesis was on Latin American economic policy.
Oh, that's interesting. Did you hear they're not going to teach Latin here anymore?
This was more like Central America.
Oh, Central America and whatnot. We're moving on. They're going to cancel Latin. They've got to make room for Japanese.
That's a shame because all the Romance languages are based in Latin.
Yeah, they are, aren't they?
Nihilo sanctum est ne?
What's that? Oh, it's Latin, isn't it? What does that mean?
Is nothing sacred?
Sic transit gloria. Glory fades. I'm Max Fisher.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, again, I think it's odd that we haven't done a Wes Anderson movie yet for the podcast. And seeing as this is the first movie we've done of his, it only seems proper to give a little bit of background because Rushmore was only Wes Anderson's second movie, and Rushmore being really the movie that I think set his career off. He made a movie prior to Rushmore called Bottle Rocket, and though I think there's a huge cult following for that movie, not that many people saw it when it first arrived in 1996.
And one could say a movie like Bottle Rocket, Rushmore, and The Royal Tannenbaums, all of these have very personal aspects to Wes Anderson or very direct connections to his life. And it seems like that's kind of how he's always operated. He's been a writer since an early age, even putting on plays in his middle school, I believe. His dad gave him a Super 8 camera when he was a kid. And even though that was something that he had a mind for, it was always about writing and about storytelling. And I think that that really does play into why his movies are the way they are. They are fables. They are these stories, these journeys that we go on. But without going really deep into Wes Anderson's what made him who he is today, there are plenty of themes that run through his films which directly correlate to his upbringing and relationship with family, brothers. There's a lot going on that you see that connect here, and we do see a lot of that in Rushmore. Though the man has a degree that he got from the University of Texas in Austin in philosophy, he actually met Owen Wilson in the late 80s, 89, I believe, as another student in Austin, and they were both taking a playwriting class together. And I found it so funny to find out that they didn't talk to each other in the class. It wasn't until the following semester when they just happened to strike up a conversation, and it was at that time when Wes Anderson said, I'd never really met someone that I wanted to write with and that I got. Like, our humor gelled together, we just got each other. And to say that you've made it that long in life when writing has been in your blood and you met someone that you wanted to write something with, that seems pretty huge.
It's interesting to me, too, that he got a degree in philosophy because the University of Texas in Austin has a fairly significant film program, even back then. It's always wild to me when such a stylistic director, you find out that they didn't, like film school wasn't their route.
I think it goes to show that the visual element of storytelling in some of these people like Tarantino and Anderson, that the visual element is always there in their mind, but it's the story that's the most interesting to them. And then the visual component is there to just enhance and make this story come to life and have it come off the page. But to me, Wes Anderson is really a storyteller.
This meetup with Owen Wilson, who didn't have an intention in the beginning to be an actor, he was more coming from a writer's angle, and that, he had this 3-movie collaboration with Wes Anderson. And I think a lot of people do consider Wes Anderson's first 3 movies as his best, where he was co-writing with Owen Wilson. And it's interesting to see like that Owen Wilson hasn't written anything else or co-written with anybody, has gone on to be like a big, huge Hollywood star, comedic star, and hasn't gone back to collaborating or being more creative behind the camera. But Wes Anderson has made some fantastic movies without him.
Well, the way that Wes Anderson described how he and Owen Wilson wrote together, how they figured out stories was, they knew each other for quite a few years and would know a billion stories of each other and would either go on trips or just be hanging out and be able to recount this one time when this happened, and just have a lot of stories behind them. So they would scribble down these ideas and give them, to each other to pass back and forth, and eventually work out some type of story or have this idea and start talking about characters and how all of these ideas are going to work into a story. And it might surprise some people that the story of Rushmore actually was being fleshed out and written before Bottle Rocket was ever even a thought. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. Rushmore is very personal. They knew kind of what they wanted from the onset. They wanted this kind of prep school vibe behind it, but had all of these stories from their early formative years. This movie is just littered with real life experiences, but it's not so much giant moments. It's little things. It's the character of Mr. Bloom, Bill Murray, having so many lines that Owen Wilson says, his father said, and distilling his father into Mr. Bloom and giving him the more disappointing aspects of his father, let's just say.
Yeah, Owen Wilson said he was expelled from the private school he was going to.
Yeah.
And his father was like on the board of trustees and something like that. And he said his father, that was a direct quote from his father saying, "I never thought that I would have children that would grow up like this." Which is kind of a very defeating line that Bill Murray uses, and his kids are just out of control. The fact that Bill Murray gravitates more toward Max than his own kids and relates to him more, I think is something that probably a lot of parents deal with. It cuts pretty deep in Rushmore.
And yeah, maybe Mr. Bloom, there are a lot of aspects that were based on Owen Wilson's father. Owen Wilson also said that the way that Mr. Bloom's kids behave, he was friends with two guys that were like that were just complete hellions towards their father. All of these things are just a jumbled kind of ball of different experiences and people that they've known throughout their life. Even Wes Anderson says that there are many aspects of himself in Max. Maybe not so much the extroverted, boisterous kind of personality that Max is. Wes Anderson was much quieter and meeker than, say, Max is. But they both share that lack of ambition towards academics, that sort of thing, and had their own vision in mind of what they wanted to do, which didn't necessarily fit well into the structured school system.
And Rushmore does feel very personal with the character of Max, in that he's overly ambitious in everything, sort of like a master of none. He does all these extracurricular activities that he's not even necessarily that good at. And not only that, he doesn't excel in math, but the opening of the movie, the very opening scene is this fantasy of him solving this unsolvable math equation that the teacher has put on the board that even, he can't answer, and that, Max does it perfectly, and everybody's like putting him up on their arms like they've just won like a state championship or something. And we'll get in discussion too, we'll talk about Jason Schwartzman's character more of Max, but since this is a special Murray-esque episode, let's get into a little bit about how Bill Murray came into this project, because it wasn't totally out of the blue. He was definitely someone that they had in mind early on in this project.
Had in mind, yeah, definitely. They wrote the part of Mr. Bloom for Bill Murray, but just thought that he would never see the script, or it just wouldn't be something that he'd be interested in. I think Bill's reputation has preceded him for many, many years. So to have him in mind to be in your film is a lofty goal. But you know what? Why not? Why not hope for that and write it for that?
It feels like a tailor-made movie for Bill Murray. It doesn't feel like a shock to me that he fits so well in this movie. And I think Bill Murray himself said that Rushmore was among like maybe 3 or 4 scripts in his career that he read. And normally he's been known as a person who improvises a lot. And he said a lot of times he gets a script and he thinks, I'm going to take the job versus how much work am I going to have to do on the script? Like, how much are they going to be expecting me to improvise, to fix things that just are not really well written or characters aren't developed? And he said, this is one of 3 scripts where he just was like, you know what, I'm just going to go with what's on the page. It's written so well and the character's so developed. I really don't need to change anything or swing for the fences on the scene to make something funny because it's already there. It's already funny.
Wes Anderson was dressing up as Peter Venkman from Ghostbusters when he was a kid for Halloween. So he had a long connection with this man, and it doesn't seem like Wes Anderson's ever let anything stand in his way of desiring to see how far he can go and make his vision come to life. So why not try to get Bill Murray in your movie? And luckily for Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson, a woman named Jessica Tushinsky at Creative Artists Agency, who represented Bill Murray at the time, was a fan of Bottle Rocket, as many people were. The movie didn't perform that well, but there were a lot of folks that talked about the film in the industry, and there was certainly a buzz behind Wilson and Anderson. So Jessica Tushinsky gets this script and suggests Bill take a look at it. And she says, it's the guys who made Bottle Rocket. And Bill's like, what are you talking about? Whatever. Yeah, send me the script. Sure, I'll take a look at it. And she says, I'll go ahead and send you a copy of Bottle Rocket along with it. I mean, if you've listened to Murray moments or have read anything on the man over the years, probably forcing him to watch a movie or telling him to do anything is probably not going to do it, or just it's not going to be first on his radar to do it. So he gets the script, reads it, and a couple days later says, okay, I'm interested in this. I really love the vision of this. I'm kind of surprised at how precise it is. And I want to talk to Wes Anderson. And I think it was Jessica Tushinsky again who said, did you watch the movie? And he says, no, it's fine. Just give me Wes's number. And she says, okay, yeah, I will. I'll go ahead and send you another copy of Bottle Rocket. And he's like, yeah, it's somewhere around here. I don't know. So he gets another copy of that. So Wes Anderson gets this call and is kind of surprised that Bill Murray seems like he's totally on board and thinks that they're going to have this conversation about what Rushmore is about, what he sees for the film, his vision for everything. But what followed was Bill talking to Wes Anderson about this 1965 Kurosawa film, Redbeard, which Wes Anderson hadn't seen before. And Bill just goes on about the movie, what happens in it, and just everything about this film. Of course, Anderson watches it later, but at the time, he's like, where is this guy going with this conversation? But then at the end, says something like, okay, I'm in it. I'd like to do Rushmore. It's so very Bill Murray, such a Murray moment by itself. And add to the Bottle Rocket video collection that Bill is racking up. Anderson asked him if he had by chance seen Bottle Rocket, and he said, no, I haven't just yet. And Wes Anderson goes ahead and sends him another copy of Bottle Rocket. I think we're up to 3 now, but then there's at least 4 and I think 5 copies, which eventually make their way to Murray. And to this day, I haven't heard that the man's actually watched Bottle Rocket.
And in some ways, I get where he's coming from of not wanting to possibly watch, what if he hated it? He's excited about the script and he's like, wait a minute, this guy made a terrible first movie.
It has nothing to do with Rushmore. This is the vision that I have for the movie, and it sounds perfect. Like I want to be involved. I don't want to risk anything else throwing that off. And man, he agreed to work for scale too. And that comes out to under $10,000. I know that, which is just insane.
Bottle Rocket was independently financed, I believe, but Rushmore, this wasn't like a tiny studio putting this movie together. I mean, this was like a Walt Disney subsidy. It just shows how much confidence people had in Wes Anderson, that he's got a movie picture set up at Disney. They're letting him shoot in Houston, Texas, where he's from, at a school that he went to. They're not making him shoot it in L.A. He's got Bill Murray joining on to a cast of relative unknowns. And you would think, you're the big actor, you're the big name that everybody knows. You're coming on to this professionally set film that's set up with a studio and everything. But it's a fairly green director. This is only his second movie. This is his first movie working with a known actor who's been, whose movies the director watched when he was a little kid. And that would have to be very nerve-wracking. And,
Yeah.
Bill Murray had a perfect opportunity to be a total a-hole here. Like, he could have come in and thrown his weight around and did things his way, but instead he was like very humble and gained the trust and respect of Wes Anderson, and even helped pitched in, financially if Wes Anderson would have needed it. I think there was an issue where Wes Anderson wanted to get some sort of helicopter shot that he felt was necessary for the movie, and the studio wouldn't budge on it. And Bill Murray said, I can write you a check if you really feel like you need that shot, and they won't pay for it, or tell them I'm going to pay for it. Maybe they'll pony up the money, playing against the studio because they don't want to be embarrassed that the lead actor is paying for a helicopter shot. As far as I know, that shot never got made or whatever. Didn't end up doing it, but just another story that shows that Bill Murray was like, he's a very genuine person who, though has this legacy behind him, come onto a set and work with a new director and create a real serious friendship. I mean, Wes Anderson's used Bill Murray in some aspect in every single movie that he's made after Rushmore. And there's one interview I saw where Bill Murray said Wes Anderson is the only person, like, he doesn't have to read the script anymore. He just says, somehow he gets contacted by Wes Anderson and just says, you just tell me when the movie will be getting made or when you need me, and I'll come down and do the movie, whatever it is, whatever role you need me to do. It's pretty insane. That's a lot of trust to put in somebody, and that's like a real friendship, like a real long collaboration. It makes me respect and appreciate Bill Murray even more, to know that he's in this position where this could have went a totally different way. And not to bag on an actor here, but I don't know why I said that, because I'm totally about to bag on somebody. For comparison's sake, and I know Kevin Smith is a much different director than Wes Anderson, but there's a very famous story that Kevin Smith tells about when he did the movie Cop Out, and he was a huge fan of Bruce Willis since he was a little kid. And he said Bruce Willis came on set, and everybody was so pumped that Bruce Willis was going to be in their movie, and he was just a total jerk and didn't care about the script. He hated that he was there. He just, threw his weight around and made it totally unfun, a total miserable experience for everybody. And that could be of the fault of maybe he didn't like the script or whatever. He didn't trust Kevin Smith as director, but it sounded like he didn't even give him a chance. Bill Murray really was giving somebody a chance and really wanting to nurture, make a good movie. And I think it really shows, and I think also too, the relationship between Bill Murray and Jason Schwartzman, like their chemistry, I think really comes off on screen, is genuine. It doesn't, and Bill Murray's like acting alongside somebody. Just was Jason Schwartzman's first movie. He wasn't even an actor, he wasn't even aspiring to be an actor. So Bill Murray's coming in, and I'm going to share a huge role, like co-starring role with this guy who's never acted, and also approached that with, dignity and respect, and didn't say, what the heck, I'm coming all the way out here to act with somebody who has not done anything.
It's really a testament to the talent involved in Rushmore. He's not exactly afraid of, showing that he's not happy in working with people that aren't prepared or just don't have it together. And even kid actors, sometimes he's not really fond of doing that, especially when there are parents on set, or all of these situations that he's been confronted with over the years. You can imagine that he can already kind of predict how certain situations are going to come up. And I can't help but think that after reading this script, that he felt so confident to just kind of blindly agree to do it, and felt confident in Wes Anderson, that he knew somewhere in himself that this guy is going to make sure that whoever else in this movie is up to par, and this isn't going to be a screw-off type of experience. And I gotta believe that that's just based on what he's been through in his life. Like, I don't think that the man's a complete saint, that, I think that he is humble, but I do think that there's some things that he can just inherently, knowing someone that's involved, like the guy that's heading everything, If you can trust that guy, then everything else is going to fall into place. And on Wes Anderson going into this project, and Jason Schwartzman for that matter, were both incredibly nervous about working with, the legend Bill Murray. But they both said that upon meeting him and getting his vibe and working with him, we're just like, okay, this is going to be totally fine. Actually, I don't know what I was freaking out about. And even Bill Murray imparted, knowledge and help to Jason Schwartzman, who had to have been a tiny bit nervous, I would imagine. I mean, the guy, sure, comes from a very famous family.
You're the main actor in a movie, in your very first movie.
In your very first
It's
movie.
A little bit of pressure.
And it's all riding on
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
And you saw your cousin massacred in the press for bad acting in Godfather 3, so you know.
The whole vibe of everything on Rushmore seemed like a collective of people that were there to really bring this unique story to life. And you've got all of Wes Anderson's crew that he had used from Bottle Rocket. So you have this built-in support system to help the newbies that are coming in that haven't worked with Wes Anderson before. So this idea of community really came together for this entire production. And Wes Anderson has said that he wanted everyone involved with this picture to be on good footing, to have this sense of friendship, because to him, the biggest theme throughout Rushmore is friendship. And it's not to say that that's the only theme, but that certainly is a huge one throughout the story.
Yeah, I think friendship is the strongest theme in Rushmore, and especially the bond that Bloom has with Max. Even though there's a second act where they're at a difference with each other and they're actually doing terrible things to each other. I think in a heightened reality sort of way, like cutting the brakes on his car, like putting bees or, riding over his bike. But I think there is, at the end of the movie, you see that they respect each other. You see that their friendship can't be broken, even though they have a difference of opinion, or if they feel like one wronged the other, they still respect each other. It also seems to like Bill Murray's character doesn't feel respected by his kids or like his wife or like anyone in his life, though he does find companionship with this teacher, that Max also likes. But also no one really identifies with Max either. Like he doesn't fit in. Everybody thinks he's weird, or he has sometimes physical fights with his classmates. He just has these bursts of violence when he can't see eye to eye with somebody. But with the Bill Murray character, they gravitate toward each other. And I think that is the key element in the movie is like their friendship. And it ends on such a great note. I mean, the end of the movie really does, it's a tearful ending, and not necessarily in a sad way. It's like it's kind of heartfelt, and with the music coming in, and you do feel like it does have, in a lot of ways, for as quirky as this movie is, it has like your feel-good Hollywood ending where everybody comes together and like every person that you've seen throughout the movie is at this play that Max puts on, and that they're all watching it, and it's like this big party at the end. Everybody's getting together and everybody's celebrating something, letting bygones be bygones. In some ways, it's like a fantastical version of how friendships work, but there's a lot of reality there. We all have friendships with people that can date back 20 or 30 years where, you can be at odds with somebody, but because you have a history, you have you know each other in a certain way, or you relate in a certain way that you don't with other people, you get each other. It's hard to throw that away. And I feel like that's like ever present in Rushmore.
Gosh, I couldn't agree more, Justin. You just kind of encapsulated everything that the film's about. The ending, to me, it is a tearful ending. Man, I can't help but still identify with Max at the end when, even though everything is coming up roses for him, everyone's proud of him, and he's being celebrated and recognized, and even his father's there, that in his heart, he still is carrying a torch for Ms. Cross. And it's such a testament to the truth of adolescence that is written into the story. Like you and I were talking off the mic about how these grandiose things that he does for Ms. Cross, if he were a 40-year-old man, would be creepy and weird. But because he's a 15-year-old, it makes sense because you do things like that when you're younger and you don't think about it. You're just going with the id. And I think that is all that Max is doing. And in a way, his otherness or his outsiderness should be celebrated. But it's so hard for him to connect to people. But by the end of the film, you see that more than just his father now understand him, at least a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the movie is as much about friendship as it is about family. But I think this is a good stopping point. Let's go to another clip from Rushmore. We'll come back. We'll talk about this brilliant cast of unknowns, as well as some of the production, Anderson's style, and then we'll talk about a little bit about the release of this movie and its reception.
Alrighty.
I like your nurse's uniform, Guy.
These are OR scrubs.
Oh, are they? Well, they're totally inappropriate for the occasion.
Well, I didn't know we were going to dinner.
That's because you weren't invited.
Take it easy, Max.
You were the one that ordered him a whiskey and soda.
So what's wrong with that? I can write a hit play. Why can't I have a little drink to unwind myself? So tell me, Curly, how do you know Miss Cross?
We went to Harvard together.
Oh, that's great. I wrote a hit play and directed it. So I'm not sweating it either.
Well, we talked quite a bit about Bill Murray and how he got involved with Rushmore, but we didn't say too much about its main star, Jason Schwartzman. I think I said a little bit earlier that, this was in fact his first movie. He was a musician. He came from a very famous family, the Coppolas, Francis Ford Coppola being his uncle. His cousin is Nicolas Cage. His cousin is Sofia Coppola. And his mom was, Adrian and Rocky.
It's just crazy.
A very, very famous and powerful Hollywood family. And he's pretty candid about getting the job. He was able to get connections through a party that I think his family was having, where there's agents there and Hollywood people, and Wes Anderson him and Owen Wilson had been looking for a year to find someone to play the lead character of Max, and they were even looking in other countries, and they were like, hey, maybe Max is British, maybe he has a British accent, just because they couldn't find anybody that really fit. And Jason Schwartzman came along. They really thought that he was right. They didn't think that he physically looked the part that they were thinking of, but he had the style and the mannerisms down, having that voice, bringing the voice off the page that they had in mind. And I think he does a really great job. It's always fascinating to me when someone who isn't an actor can just kind of like naturally fall into creating a character like that. I also think of like John Heder in Napoleon Dynamite. Somebody who wasn't like had been acting forever, and they do this. Their first role was like kind of phenomenal. And Jason Schwartzman really, I love his style in this movie, but I really also love that he looks like a 15-year-old kid, which I think was like a really important thing for this movie, is to have not be someone who's like 20 or 21, someone who's mature that's supposed to play this mature role, but finding someone who actually looks like they could be in like 10th or 11th grade.
He was a senior in high school, and it was in 97 when he was at this party that his family was having. It was like a charity event, I guess, party. But yeah, he has his cousin Sophia to thank, because she happened to strike up a conversation with one of the casting directors of Rushmore and started talking about the plot of this movie. And Sophia said, "That's funny. It kind of sounds like my cousin," describing the character of Max. And just coincidentally, and probably very fortunately for Jason Schwartzman, and when he was at this charity event party, it was centered around his composer grandfather, where all of these musical pieces were being performed. So he thought going to this, he was going to come to it kind of dressed over the top, kind of like how Max would. He said he had a top hat and a jacket with tails on the back of it. So he's talking to the casting director of Rushmore dressed up like this. And the casting director is like, "You kind of really fit this image of this character, maybe not physically, but we really want you to audition." And to Jason Schwartzman, he thought, "Really? You think so? I mean, I've never been in a movie. I'm just a drummer, man. I'm just back. I'm the guy that nobody pays attention to." So the next day, the script shows up to his house, and he does end up auditioning and shows up to the audition in a prep school type jacket with a homemade Rushmore patch that he'd made. So, I mean, you kidding me? You're going to show up to an audition like that when you have the confidence and look of Schwartzman? Yeah, I can see why Wes Anderson amended the image that he and Owen Wilson originally had. Basically, Wes Anderson, the scrawny, kind of sickly looking guy.
And don't you love movies like this where in this, I can't think of any like recent examples, but I think it's like a rare event whenever a movie hits like this where you see an actor and this is like their very first movie, but they're like the main star, and you're watching, you're like, whoa, who is this person? Because no one knows who they are. Again, I bring up Napoleon Dynamite, but I also think of Almost Famous that we've done on the podcast.
Yeah.
It's just you see a performance by someone and it makes the movie, I don't know, a little more interesting because you can't place them. It's just so much different than watching a movie with an unknown versus like, well, it's the new Keanu Reeves or it's the new Tom Cruise. It's like we've seen these people for 20 years, so you can place them so easily because they reuse some of the same tricks and ticks and styles and mannerisms that in different characters, but watching somebody brand new, it's always a bit exciting. Rushmore was definitely that movie for me, like just walking out of it thinking, whoa, who is this guy? Where did he come from?
And there is something that really pops about him on screen, and not to be so basic as to say an appearance, but this kid who really is a kid, but has these giant eyebrows, this jet black hair, and just these features that are somewhat uncommon when it comes to the main star of a movie. And to have him offset with Bill Murray, who you can almost see how he is kind of the younger version of who Mr. Bloom used to be, and by having someone that is so striking and atypical to who you see leading a movie, you're very drawn in, and the confidence of Max and that Schwartzman definitely has. And I don't think that that's something that he magically came up with. I think the guy has always been fairly confident, even if he didn't necessarily think that there was a chance in hell he would get this role. I think that there's a reason that it was spotted, in him, that he had those qualities of Max, whether he was humble about the idea of even it being a possibility or not.
And I think they did a really good job of casting his father with Seymour Cassel because Seymour Cassel has always had kind of like an old man face, but with the big eyebrows. And like you could see, you can really picture Jason Schwartzman and Seymour Cassel, that he looks like it could have been a young version of him. And also getting such a veteran actor. I mean, Seymour Cassel, God, has been around since like the 50s, like did a ton of movies with John Cassavetes, and he just always been a fantastic character actor, and occasionally doing a lot of independent films mixed with huge, big budget movies like Dick Tracy, stuff like that. Always awesome to see him pop up, but it's great. I love how they got some of these really strong character actors, like Brian Cox, who plays the head of the school, and people that you may not know their names, but you definitely distinctly know their faces, and like, oh man, I've seen this guy in like 50 movies.
And I love that Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson wanted Brian Cox because they loved him in Manhunter. And for those of you that remember, do you remember LIE, Justin?
Yes.
That was one that hit me when it came out, and man, that's what I think of when I look at Brian Cox. That movie just stuck with me. He's such a wonderful actor, and then to see Manhunter years and years later, seeing him in anything, I look forward to it. So when he pops up in this as the head of Rushmore, it's like, yeah, that fits. Totally, he would be.
He's in a movie called Red. Have you ever seen that?
It's funny. I have it, and I still haven't watched it yet, but it's in I know that I need to. Someone brought that up to me the other day, actually, and I'm like, yeah, I know. I need to watch it. And probably we would say maybe third build would be Olivia Williams, who plays Ms. Cross, the object of affection for Max and Mr. Bloom. I think that her role is fairly understated in this, but I do appreciate that her deepness and sadness is slowly revealed in a way that is through the other characters. And we get a little bit of insight into how she feels, but mainly it's through the conversations and interactions with Max mostly, but she doesn't just exist for these men to just be the object of their affection. And she stands up for herself and never gives into this idea of liking the fact that a kid is interested in her, which I think some stories would veer towards, but I never get that drift with their relationship. And she also says, and I can't have this relationship with Mr. Bloom because he hates himself, but I'm caught up in my own sadness as well. But she's still working through it. I really adore her character. And I think that, if anything, her character could have been expounded on a little bit more.
Yeah, I do like that we do see the flip, though, of her character, finally getting pretty upset with Max, like just getting kind of frustrated with both of these guys in their like affection toward her. Also, too, just the relationship between her and Max. This was one of those movies where you watch in 2021, you're like, oh, is this going to be even a little bit creepy? But it's not a provocative movie in the way that you would think it would be when you hear the storyline of the student starts liking his teacher and then they start hanging out. They play it very tasteful, in that you never really question, like, why on earth would she go have like a lunch with him or something? But it makes sense that she doesn't look at him as a little kid till he shows himself as a little kid, and throws a tantrum because she's invites Luke Wilson to their post-play dinner.
I think it's short-sighted to say that there's no way a teacher could have some type of a friendship with a 15-year-old kid. If she does find him intriguing and, more of an adult or stands out amongst the other kids in school, sure. I mean, I had teachers that I felt like I connected with on another level when I was in high school that wasn't just student-teacher relationship. Like, I actually liked them. And I feel that is what's happening here, that Miss Cross, she's not even entertaining like that idea, but when she knows that is what Max is thinking, she calls him out directly.
Yeah.
It's not this thing that is wishy-washy or she's trying to be coy about it. She's straight up like, hey, you know that I'm much older than you, right? And this is ridiculous. And that is why this isn't a cringy type of storyline in 2021.
I agree. I think a real standout for me in this movie, one of the characters I love the most is Mason Gamble, is Dirk Calloway.
Yeah.
And he just has this... It's almost like chilling. I think it's a shame that he didn't get picked to do a movie like The Good Son or like The Bad Seed. I think he would have just really been absolutely perfect, because he does have this very Americana, the perfect boy next door, but then he can do those faces where he just looks like, he's going to murder Bill Murray and like just the stare down. I think I would have loved to have seen him do like a Bad Seed type movie.
It's funny when you say The Good Son, because it must have been thought that this would be the next Macaulay Culkin.
I think it was like Wes Anderson or Owen Wilson said they were a little bit worried about using him at first because he had just come off of Dennis the Menace as Dennis the Menace, and that movie was, a minor hit, and they were worried, like, is anyone going to be able to, is he too Dennis the Menace-y? Like, is he just going to be that character? But then as Wes Anderson was saying, Mason Gamble was such a good actor to where he could make adjustments, like almost robotically. Like, he could say, can you do it this way? And he'd be like, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And he would like adjust himself and then do the next take, exactly how Wes Anderson wanted. And it's kind of, he's not really been in too many movies. It's kind of crazy to me because he really, and it may be just one of those things where child actors, they get burnt out on it or something, but he's really great in this movie.
He is for sure a standout. The confrontation where he steps in front of Mr. Bloom's car and calls him out and spits on his car. I'm scared. What is he supposed to be, like 12, 13, 14? I'm scared of that kid. He's really great in this, and the friendship that he and Max have, the evolving friendship where he's, in some ways looks up to him, but then he also sees that Max needs a little bit of assistance too, then going to being upset with Max about him lying to him. And, there's this evolution that is always a theme in Wes Anderson films where kids try to act like adults and adults act like kids. But whether an adult or a child, they're going through these same motions. And it always goes back to this idea that I love in general, that no matter what age we are always the same and always going through the same changes. It just might be a different scenario in life.
And Wes Anderson, he has so many, there's so many tiny little parts in this movie where he has an eye for either, he's going to use his friends that he knows can do the job, or if there's like an extra that looks interesting or is doing something interesting, he's, quick to like, let's use them for more scenes or like in the background. Also, another interesting choice is Kumar Palana, who plays Mr. Little Jeans, but was also been like a Wes Anderson standout. Like he was in, he plays Kumar in Bottle Rocket and Pagoda in Royal Tenenbaums.
He's great in Royal Tenenbaums.
He's so great in Royal Tenenbaums. But it's just like, I just love that he has so few scenes, but I love, just in Rushmore too. It's just like best play I ever saw. It's just like so endearing.
Oh man, Sarah Tanaka, who plays Margaret Yang, the girl in public school that is enamored a little bit with Max and is completely blown off by him, but then calls him out for it, and then they later become friends. Margaret Yang, that's a good character that could go on much further or show up. I would want her to show up in another Wes Anderson movie.
And a person who became huge that is just a background extra in the movie, Alexis Bledel, who went on to be Rory in Gilmore Girls.
Yeah, that's right.
And Luke Wilson, brother of Owen, as well as Andrew Wilson, the two Wilson bros, had little bit roles in this movie. Andrew Wilson is the coach who is very upset that his field is about to be turned into a aquarium.
A giant aquarium. Because Max is trying to win the affection of Miss Cross by making an aquarium.
Yeah, because she likes fish.
Such a 15-year-old thing to do.
And Luke Wilson is her boyfriend, who I think gets the biggest laugh in the movie, is the whole exchange between him and Jason Schwartzman.
And it should also be said that that was a line that was made up by Luke Wilson, that he was the one who thought up Max's punchline, and it works so perfectly in that scene.
I think that was in the trailer too. That was a big laugh.
I've said that line I don't know how many times in my life. It doesn't matter how cheesy or if it works, you kind of make it work because it is that bad, but also that good.
Like how often is that joke being thrown around as someone who just starts working at a hospital?
Oh, I'm sure.
You're just like waiting for somebody to say,
oh, are they?
Yeah.
Bill Murray's reaction in that too, it epitomizes everyone's feeling towards that line.
I love that Bill Murray can take an old gag like almost spitting out your drink, but like still make that look fresh.
It doesn't look like it wasn't natural.
Yeah, but yeah, it's such a beautifully cast movie. We should keep moving on. Just wanted to briefly, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but just touching on Wes Anderson's distinct style. He really is a director who has so much attention to detail in the production design, the set design, the costumes, hair and makeup. And, and I'm not saying that every director isn't interested in they're making millions of decisions and they're consulting with all these different departments, but Wes Anderson seems to, his movies all look and feel a certain way, like they all choose a particular color palette. They all seem like hyper reality in their look and their feel, and he just seems so like precise in like what he wants the look to be and how he wants, colors to dictate a certain character, and the costuming. A lot of times everybody has this distinct look, even all the way, as early as, Bottle Rocket, but definitely Rushmore, and even more further in Life Aquatic and Royal Tenenbaums, and so on and so on. Every single one of his movies, it's a group costume for Halloween.
Oh my gosh, you're totally right. It is. And with costuming, if you look at Rushmore specifically, I think in all of his movies this happens. Everyone has their particular style or particular outfit. But with Rushmore, no one really changes clothes too much. They have their specific style. And when they are in a different attire, there's some type of change that's happened in their life. And it could be Bill Murray, who's really at a low point in his life, or it could be when Max is kind of gone down the tubes and he has gotten in 4 fights in a row and just he is at the bottom. And then he reemerges as kind of like a reinvented man. You know, everyone changes. And with that, with the evolution of their character, their outfit changes as well.
He's one of those directors where if I came over to somebody's house, and this is kind of my test, like I'm going over anybody's house and watching movies. I never do that, but I always use this example of like being younger, of like, you know what I mean? If I went over to someone's house and they said, hey, I'm going to throw on a Wes Anderson movie, they could just like throw any movie on and I'd be down to sit down to watch it, versus if they were like, hey, I'm going to put on a Francis Ford Coppola movie or like a Martin Scorsese, I'm like, well, which one? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, what are we about to sit down and watch?
I don't know if I'm in the mood for it.
I don't know if I'm ready to watch Kundin at Tuesday at 7 p.m.
There is a vibe, a Wes Anderson vibe throughout all of his films. And that's not necessarily saying that it's following the same storyline, but there are enough similarities, whether it comes to the set design or the general themes that go all throughout his films, that it is something that connects to people on an emotional level and on a visually appealing level. His movies aren't just something that are good in one vein, or it's good for just the storytelling, or it's really action-packed or something. All of his films have varying degrees of these things. There's drama, there's extreme moments of funniness in all of his films. And then there are moments of violence. There are moments of darkness. There's just a lot of things that appeal to so many people. And on top of it, like I said in the beginning of the episode, it is like you are watching a moving painting half the time, you know. And yes, Justin, I totally agree with you that his movies evolve and have become even bigger, you know, over time. And I think I still connect to the Rushmore, Tannenbaums, and Life Aquatic era. I think Life Aquatic is where the big shift starts to happen, but it's not quite the full transition into, I think, the next stage of his career.
The more I watch Grand Budapest Hotel, the more I think Wes Anderson did like Indiana Jones movie, you know? It's,
yeah, completely agree with you.
It's very moving. I mean, I don't think it was a movie that really kind of got me choked up the first time I saw it, but like the last viewing that I did of it, I mean, there was like multiple times where I was like, man, this is really, you know, hitting me hard.
And just as somebody who actually, I just crammed in Darjeeling Limited and Grand Budapest Hotel and then rewatched all of the Wes Anderson movies that I had already seen. Admittedly, I couldn't watch Fantastic Mr. Fox or Isle of Dogs, not because I don't own both of them. It's just that I have a dog that watches TV that can't handle animals on television, and we made it 23 minutes, I think, into Fantastic Mr. Fox, and I was holding him and he's just shaking and whining. I can't watch the movie with that, so I gotta figure out something else. But it's not because I don't have both of them and I want to watch them. It's just impossible. But one thing in watching all of these movies in order as much as I could, just seeing all of the similarities and how they are all so varyingly different. But I love with Rushmore, we see kind of where it changed from Bottle Rocket to Rushmore, where Rushmore was the framework for everything else, whether it's the symmetrical framing that he would do, or just, I mean, framing is such a very important thing in Wes Anderson, whether it's set up for just composition or blocking or for camera movement. All of these things play such a huge role in how he is telling a story, and they're also precise, just that very fundamental thing that convinced Bill Murray to do Rushmore in the first place. He knew that this guy has a vision, and you see all of the particularities in everything that he's trying to communicate, even down to the editing and how his use of montages, it doesn't feel like a montage. It's showing the passage of time, but it's in such a way that you need all of this information. You want all of this information, and it's being fed to you relatively quickly, but you don't even notice that it's a montage. And the montages in Rushmore, I don't know what my favorite one is. if it's Max and Mr. Bloom trying to like get in shape, or whether it's Max and his varying clubs. There are just so many ways that Anderson chooses to communicate information to you. It just really helps you understand the characters, and it's all important, and it's all throughout his movies, every single one of them. And if anything, it just gets more intense with each movie that has occurred.
I like his use of using text on screen to, like, say who the characters' names are, what they're about. It got adopted by so many other filmmakers. It's not like Wes Anderson was the first person to do this, but his use of slow motion for like a comedic scene, like a character doing something a bit comedic in slow motion while there's a needle drop for like a really good song. I think Darjeeling Limited is like one of my favorite scenes where it slows down and he's trying to catch the train and it's like a wide shot. His use of music, I think, in all of his movies is very significant, particularly in Rushmore, like not so much using a score for everything, but doing this Scorsese route where like I'm going to use, though I think he finds a way of like, he's not using hit songs that everybody's heard of. It was almost like he brought new attention to these old songs from the 70s, or like more like a British new wave songs that maybe the average music listener wouldn't be aware of.
Yeah, his decision to use almost all music from the Kinks, it helps create this atmosphere and just this unifying feeling that this is all about, this is Max's world, and that there's a little bit of anger, there's love, but there's also just this feeling of rebellion, but it's also kind of stifled in some way, frustrated in some way. And Anderson's decision to use British invasion type music wasn't the only usage of music in the film. He also teamed up with Mark Mothersbaugh, and together they sussed out a lot of ideas, but came down to the feeling that there needed to be a lot of mandolin involved. So notice that in amongst the Kinks music that you hear, probably the most predominant, I would say. For me, that's what sticks out in it. But those moments when you do hear the Mothersbaugh addition to it, that to me is Rushmore, is the feeling behind this elitist prep school that is Rushmore. That's what that is. And then the other half of it is Max's frustration of being an outsider and wanting to break out of that. But the entire musical homage that is everything Rushmore feels so planned out and, again, precise. Wes Anderson is nothing if not precise and planned out with everything that he does.
Yeah. And I definitely, one of my Spotify playlists is just music from Wes Anderson movies.
Man, I gotta do that.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, I bet.
I'll share my playlist with you.
Yeah, please do.
Well, let's get into the release of this film. This movie had a little bit of an unusual release. The Toronto Film Festival was a huge thing, and a lot of movies open there that are like big, huge studio movies. But in the early 90s, most film festivals like Sundance or New York Film Festival or Telluride, occasionally they'd have a few movies with like a name actor or something, but a lot of the movies were like independently financed, but then maybe a studio picked them up for distribution or they got bought at the festival. It was very rare for a movie that had a $10 million budget that was, produced by Disney, that starred Bill Murray, to be like opening at all these film festivals. But it played the festival circuit like New York Film Festival, Telluride, Toronto, and became a big, huge festival hit. And since it was playing all of these festivals, it was getting, critics were noticing it, because a lot of times when the movie comes out, if the studios are worried, they don't know how the movie's if it's gonna get acclaimed, that the critics don't really see it until the general audience does. But I remember when this movie came out, like in the trailer, it was like all these, it was like all the critics had seen it and loved it. So it had all this critical acclaim coming in to give it that push when it hit like the general audiences and was like starting to play in theaters. That push from hitting festivals and garnering all this critical acclaim really made people aware of it. And especially if you followed like indie film magazines or anything like that, like you knew, you had heard of Rushmore, and it did pretty decent. It doubled its money at the box office. It wasn't like this huge hit, but it did okay for itself. And then also once it hit theaters, like more critics were like loving on this movie, and Wes Anderson kind of became, critical indie film darling, kind of cemented that with Royal Tenenbaums, where it seemed like there was like not a critic that disliked that movie. Maybe a few, but that seemed to be the movie where they said, this is Wes Anderson is like, we're going to watch whatever he puts out after that movie.
Yeah, like we loved Rushmore, but Royal Tenenbaums is where it's at, and he can do no wrong, basically, after that.
Well, let's stop there. We'll come back. We'll have some final thoughts on Rushmore, but we should get into our picks of the week. Lindsay, you did this is, I think, a first for me, where you did a movie that caught me off guard. Very few times do you have a pick of the week and I have to like IMDb it, but that happened to me on this one. What can you tell me about Hamlet, since I know so little about it?
Well, I'm not sure about this, but the idea of adapting Shakespeare into film seems like it could be pretty polarizing. Sort of a love it or hate it type of thing. And I am far from a Shakespeare expert. I've read my fair share of his works and seen a few performances, but I dare say that this film may be one of my favorite Shakespeare film adaptations. For those of you who know nothing about Hamlet, let me do a crude breakdown of one of the world's most famous plays and works of art ever written. So, Hamlet's father, the King of Denmark, he dies, returns as a ghost to tell his son to avenge his death, believing that the person responsible for his death was his own brother, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, who has now assumed the role of the king and has taken up with Hamlet's mother. It is a story about doubts, revenge, depression, struggling with trusting oneself and those closest to Hamlet, lots of double-crossing. It's a super engrossing story, which can leave one feeling a bit of Hamlet's own madness by the end. And while this 2000 update follows the story quite well, from what I remember anyway, it doesn't cover everything in the play. But that could be said for any book to movie adaptation, play to movie. It's just what happens. You just gotta kind of accept it. However, director and screenwriter Michael Almereyda kept this adaptation as true to the heart and spirit of Shakespeare's intentions. But what's a total blast is that it's set in contemporary time, right smack in the middle of Manhattan. So we're hearing all of this beautiful dialogue, having not amended from how Shakespeare originally wrote it, but it's set in modern times. And for anyone who struggles to follow Shakespeare unless it's written on paper, just put on the captions for this movie. It's way more enjoyable if you follow the spoken words, and it'll save you from having to rewind going, wait, what's going on exactly? Because you can watch this movie and miss the dialogue and just know what's happening by everyone's actions. It's just way more fun, though. I put on the captions. I don't know. Does that make me sound like I'm 95 years old? I don't know. But it's way more enjoyable to do that. One of the best scenes in the movie is Hamlet walking through a Blockbuster while delivering the most well-known to be or not to be soliloquy. It's just such a beautiful blend of postmodern re-envisioning of this old world tale, yet still something incredibly relatable by today's standards. No matter if it's 2021, 2000, when the movie was made, or the 1600s, when this was written. We just understand the story to its extreme emotional core. Another aspect Almereyda includes is the use of modern technology like cameras, answering machines, recording devices, all of these things that are completely foreign to Shakespeare plays, but the inclusion here helps reinforce Hamlet's intense paranoia as he travels through this world of doubting himself and everyone around him and being conflicted about wanting to avenge his father's death in the most violent of fashions. For instance, instead of seeing his father as an apparition, the king appears on a closed-circuit television before Hamlet actually sees him in a tangible way. There are also numerous instances of videos playing in the background of scenes which serve to reinforce what is happening in the actual story. Of course, there are a ton of updated differences. 400 years have passed since this story was written. My favorite simple difference of this is when Hamlet is trying to make his uncle confess to murdering his father. In the play, he writes a play wherein the situation is acted out, with the intent of horrifying his uncle, thus forcing a confession. But in the film version, he creates this short film that is actually pretty cool and very direct and causes the same desired effect. To make this lofty vision of Hamlet like this, or any production really, you need to have a seasoned, sturdy, well-spoken crop of actors who can make that transition from play to film for any Shakespeare story, as well as put butts in those movie theater seats. And Hamlet's cast is a regular who's who. Of course, what brought me to this movie is Mr. Bill Murray, who plays Polonius, the eldest counsel of Claudius, Hamlet's uncle. And I've got to applaud the man for taking on this role. It's a challenge to portray Shakespeare characters on screen, and Bill pulls off playing a caring friend and father, yet a total blabbermouth and gossip queen, who ultimately meets his, well, if you know the story, you know what happened. Let's just say for Murray fans, you hardly ever get to see the man injured ever in a movie, but boy, do we see it here. In the title role is Ethan Hawke, which probably comes as no surprise to anyone who understands the actor to be very well read, introspective, and a creatively thorough type of guy. I think he's absolutely wonderful as Hamlet, even in his 90s style beanie. And who out there is a Twin Peaks fan? Because we've got Kyle MacLachlan coming in as the super dark and devious Claudius with that smarmy, sexy charm he can muster up every now and again. Diane Venora as Queen Gertrude, Hamlet's mother. Ugh, it's hard for me to feel bad for her as a character, but it's very obvious Ms. Venora can clearly bring the stage to the screen, amending where necessary. And not to be outdone at all, Julia Stiles plays Ophelia, daughter of Polonius and former, current maybe love interest of Hamlet. And her poor, tormented back and forth with Hamlet is necessary to the story, and Stiles handles the part with grace, drenched in darkness. Her brother, Laertes, played by Liev Schreiber, this guy is probably the only one who feels a little more old-worldy, stage-like than everyone, but it's somewhat impossible to feel out of place in the story because the whole film is such an amalgamation. You're also going to run into Steve Zahn playing Rosencrantz of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are two of Hamlet's friends that prove to have their loyalties elsewhere. And Justin, I know you love some Sam Shepard, and he plays the ghost or Hamlet's deceased father. And though he has many moments of on-screen time, his performances are limited, but nevertheless extremely powerful. I know I need to wrap this up, but real quickly, please take note of how the color usage affects the overall feel and tone of the film. It really plays into the coldness and isolation Hamlet is feeling with the bluish hues and blackest blacks. Vibrancy sticks out when it does appear, but we're always reminded of that chill throughout the air when revenge is on the mind and Hamlet feels alone in the world. Oh, and also the music. As a longtime fan of the trip-hop band Morcheeba, it was absolutely delightful and very appropriate to hear them a few times. In general, the soundtrack is eclectic and deliberate in song placement, so listen for those musical cues as well. I was just so pleased with this version of Hamlet, not only for its visual communication to the audience and performances, but also how the source material was adhered to, yet made all anew. Re-envisioning Shakespeare is a high challenge, which was certainly mastered here and deserves a watch for anyone who's not seen it.
I don't know. You've got me sold on this. I'm going to give it a go. I've not always been a big fan of like Shakespeare into movie adaptations. Some of them I've liked, but I think that's why I must have just this one slipped past me and not even knowing about it.
I think it is something that a Shakespeare purist might feel is a bastardization because it is a modern re-envisioning. There's just something that really sells me on this movie. It's completely unique.
Well, I can assure you I'm no Shakespeare purist, so I'll probably like it.
I can't wait for the verdict on this. You can borrow it anytime.
All right.
All right, it's your turn, Justin. Tell me about your pick.
So my pick of the week was Permanent Midnight. I'm starting this pick of the week like I've done many of my picks of the week in the past, where the way I talk about this movie, you're going to think like, did you even like this thing? But I say this, and you'll know what I mean when I get to it. I really do enjoy this movie. I seem to enjoy movies about strung out junkies. I don't know why. Even the bad ones, I just like junkie drug movies. And so this is, I think, a pretty decent one. A lot of why it's good, I think, is because of Ben Stiller. And because it's based on a true story of a Hollywood writer, Jerry Stahl. He wrote a book called Permanent Midnight, and this movie is based off of his book. It's a autobiography of his time in Hollywood. He moved from New York to Hollywood, ended up getting a job writing for the television show Alf. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was a pretty goofy 80s show about basically a cheap puppet named Alf that was supposed to be an alien in the show living with this suburban family, and like really sitcom 80s TV. in the movie, they I guess couldn't get the rights, so he's not writing for the show Alf. He's writing for a show called Mr. Chompers. But when he arrives in L.A., he's already kind of addicted to prescription drugs, as well as his friend is a drug addict played by Owen Wilson. He immediately gets hooked up in a scheme of like helping this woman get her green card by marrying her, played by Elizabeth Hurley in a really great role. His addiction grows stronger. He eventually gets into heroin. He's making $5,000 a week as a Hollywood television writer, but has like a $6,000 a week heroin habit. It's this section of the movie that Ben Stiller's just so freaking great. I mean, there's scenes where it's almost like I just get like my throat gets dry watching him, because it's like he plays like this strung out junkie so well, where he's like sweating and like pounding water and like can barely talk straight, and trying to do all. There's many scenes that I think play funny, in that dark comedy style, where the scene is so messed up because it's like depressing. He's like so strung out, but he's like trying to do these pitch meetings and like get these different writing jobs. His performance alone is worth watching the movie, in my opinion. I think that's the reason to watch the movie. The big problem I have with the movie that I think brings it down for me is the storytelling, because all the stuff with Ben Stiller, like behind the scenes Hollywood insider stuff, and him like getting hooked on heroin is all the interesting stuff. But the way they frame this story is, in the beginning of the movie, he's clean and he meets up with this woman, and they have like this 2-day stint in this hotel where they're having sex. She's a former junkie, so she's asking him about his story. And so he's like telling her the story of him being a junkie in LA, like in between their different moments of having sex. And like, then we flash back. It's like a corny or lazy way to like, because he's got such an interesting story. I don't know why, to me, it would have been awesome just to play it without doing all this cutting back to the hotel with them. And they kind of tie it together at the end. There's a reason for it, but to me, it wasn't worth having to like do this whole flashbacky stuff. Outside of that, Ben Stiller I think this is the best performance that he's ever given. And there's also a great Janine Garofalo doing her thing, that she does so well. She's got a tiny bit part as someone who's trying to become Ben Stiller's agent. Any movie about someone who's a junkie can be depressing, but because we start out seeing him clean and we know that the end result is like not going to be him like dying in some hotel room, it kind of keeps it from going into like a darker direction that some movies about people like going, completely spiraling out of control. It also doesn't subject you to like very painful like rehab scenes, which some drug movies can do. So I would say in my scale of like drug movies, I'd put this solidly in the middle.
Yeah, I could say it's solidly in the middle is pretty accurate. If you like Ben Stiller, only know him from slapstick comedies of the 2000s, you got to watch this one.
Yeah. Well, those are our picks of the week, Hamlet and Permanent Midnight. Lindsay, you got the day off for this Murray moment because this was such a heavy Bill Murray episode. So,
I mean, do you want to know the scene where Max releases bees on Mr. Bloom in the hotel room, that actually the bees that were released, the ones that couldn't sting, weren't moving appropriately, so they had to release the worker bees, and Bill wasn't afraid of being stung. He just was like, yeah, let's do it.
That's commitment. Before we close this thing out, Lindsay, did you have any final thoughts on Rushmore or just Wes Anderson in general?
Gosh, for Rushmore in general, since it had been so long since I had watched this, I was reminded upon this revisiting how much I connected with it as a high schooler, and maybe the extremes that Max goes to, not so much, even though I can definitely identify some cringy moments in my high school of being a little extra. But the feeling of being an outsider, outcast, not really being understood, really did identify with that, and kind of brought back some of those feelings with Max and him being into performing plays, that sort of thing. I really did identify with that aspect of Max, and just everything. The overall vibe of Rushmore lives very deeply in my heart. As far as Wes Anderson, as I said before, I did watch all of his movies in order, except for all of the ones that deal specifically with animals only. But on the animal tip, I noticed something that I hadn't ever thought of before, and I want to know what the dude's connection is with harming animals. He obviously loves them, but if you notice, there's so many times where a dog is needlessly killed or a cat thrown out a window, or it's mentioned that an animal dies in a violent way. I really want to know what his connection is. Like, did something happen in his past? Did he have a dog die that was super connected to, and he's not ever going to be over it? I mean, God love you, man. I feel that. I just want to know why the animal violence.
Yeah, until you mentioned that to me, I didn't really think about it, but then I started thinking about his movies, and I was like, oh man, you're right. There is multiple movies where there's a pet death or it's used in some sort of comical fashion.
And it's not really that we see it happen. Either we're told about it or we're watching people's reactions to an animal dying.
Yeah.
Just a weird thing to include in all of your movies. There's got to be something there for him. Those are my thoughts. I have a billion more. I've got a billion Murray moment stories, out of Rushmore. But Justin, please tell me, what's your final thought?
Yeah, I didn't have anything too crazy. I mean, I think we covered most of the thoughts I had on Rushmore. With Wes Anderson, I just, again, think he's one of the few filmmakers that has like such a distinct style that there's really nobody else like him. I am a huge movie collector, and the Criterion Collection puts out great Blu-rays and DVDs, and usually like great packaging with lots of supplemental material. For us is always just fantastic because we can get heavy into our research for these movies. But Wes Anderson seems to be like one of the few directors where they have almost like every single one of his movies have put out like this like fantastic Blu-ray DVD with like tons of extras on them. I own most of them, and man, they look great. He has to feel pretty good about himself that all his movies are like preserved and like have had these like very like boutique releases. He's one of those filmmakers. I mean, same with Scorsese, same with Quentin Tarantino. If they have a movie coming out, I'll go see it in the theater. I mean, I'll blindly watch it.
So we got to plan a date to go see The French Dispatch.
We'll do it.
Okay. All right.
Well, I guess the best way to close out Rushmore is to say once again, happy birthday to Bill Murray.
Yes, happy birthday, Bill.
And we hope you've enjoyed our episode on Rushmore. We're about to move into our favorite time of the year, October, Halloween season. If you're new to the podcast or if you're a new listener, you may not know this about us. If you've been listening all along, you definitely know that we are big horror movie fans. It was really hard not to make this just a horror movie podcast. But we love so many movies in general, but we do take the month of October to really get into our love of horror movies. We usually also do one extra episode for October. So we have 3 Halloween-themed episodes, horror movie episodes coming up next month. So watch our social media. We should have a schedule up for that soon to let you know what movies we'll be doing. And this is a series we're doing 40th anniversary horror movies. All 3 of the movies we're doing are celebrating their 40th anniversary, the first one being American Werewolf in London. So look forward to that. Check out our social media at Don't Push Pause Podcast. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube. We also have our own website at don'tpushpausepodcast.com where you can check out all of our old episodes are archived there, as well as we have a store. We have all kinds of movie memorabilia type stuff for sale, posters, as well as a lot of merch that has our logo on it. If you're a fan of the podcast, please pick up something from there. All the money that you spend in our store helps us build a bigger and better podcast for years, so we appreciate it so much. Until next time, I'm Justin Johnson.
And I'm Lindsay Reaper.
Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, guys.
Poor old granddad, I laughed at all his words. I thought he was a bitter man who spoke of women's ways. The trap you